Awesome, thank you. So, obviously, you guys know I'm Brittany Reeves, Sheitelhau Historical Combat, Mesa, Arizona. I am so stoked to be doing this. I know with the whole pandemic thing, we're all kind of missing HEMA, so being able to do online stuff is pretty fun, and I'm very excited. So I'm just going to jump right into it, but I will just say I can't see your guys' chat because my phone, the way it's set up, I won't see it. So just make sure that you put your questions in the chat. It'll be sent to me, and I will periodically kind of touch base and see if there are any questions. I'm super happy for questions, so don't hesitate to ask about whatever comes up. There's no dumb questions. There's no bad questions. I sort of intend this class to be useful for novice and intermediate students learning and to build good biomechanics, but it'll also be useful for senior students and instructor level so that they can identify common problems. Maybe they don't always know how to fix it. They know something's wrong, but they're just not exactly sure what it is. So, like I said, there's no dumb questions, so don't worry about it. But let's get started. So biomechanics is sort of a buzzword in HEMA. It's a very trendy word that everybody likes to use when we're just talking about basically form, good structural form of our body. And we do that to prevent injury and then to increase our efficiency using our tools, being swords or wrestling or whatever it is. We want to make sure that we have good sound structure through our bodies to get the maximum effect from what we're doing. And that's all biomechanics is. It's not, it doesn't have to be this scary word that people are like, well, it means really perfect form. It just means optimizing the way we use our bodies. So with that said, we're going to start, I think, from the bottom up. So I am going to talk first about my feet. I am going to tilt the camera for you in just a second. But I'm going to start from the ground up because there's sort of a logical progression I'm going to go with. It's going to just start from the feet. We're going to go to the knees, the hips, the low back and core, shoulders, elbows, and hands. And that's kind of how we're going to go. So we're going to just start with feet. Now again, I'm going to just reiterate, this is specifically for longsword. So some of you that might do rapier or other kinds of HEMA weapon systems, this you might find is actually contradictory to some of the stuff you already know. This is just from my experience doing longsword, so it's not completely applicable to something like rapier or classical fencing. There are differences, and I will touch on some of that as we go. So let's just get a little tilt here. For feet, the most flattering angle of all angles here. Okay, so one of the things I like to talk about first and foremost is foot drags. When we do our footwork, a lot of the times when we're learning, we have a tendency to drag our feet as we step. Sometimes we will drag from the side of the foot. Other times we'll turn and we'll drag on the toe. And this is really, really common with new people who are just learning their footwork, but I do see it oftentimes with more experienced people who just developed the habit and never thought to fix it because they never thought it was a big deal. And again, it is really common. So what we want to look for is start with our fighting stance, right? We want our feet not in line. And what I mean by in line is you can see these lines on my patio, these little grid lines. If I have one foot on the line, I don't want my other heel to be right directly behind it, right? So I'll show you that other angle. I'll use this line here. I have my foot on one line, foot on the other. So this is something I want to avoid, and we see it a lot when we watch people fencing or sparring at full speed. A lot of people will start in a good position, and they'll start narrowing up and start doing this. So again, this type of footwork is applicable to other sword systems. For longsword, not so much. We want to make sure that we're actually in a good, strong, stable position in order to maintain good structure through our cuts, our thrusts, or our slices, but also because wrestling is integral, there we go, that's the word, to sword fighting. So you have to be prepared to be able to deal with close plays that end up in standing grapples or attempted throws. And you're not going to be able to do that with a really narrow stance. It's very off balance. You're going to have to catch yourself. So now, once we're in that nice fighting stance, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get up to the knees, but with the feet when we're stepping, I want to make sure that I'm on the balls of my feet. Okay? When I say balls of my feet, I don't mean to I don't want to exaggerate that so much that I'm like literally up on my toes here. This is not very stable at all. It's kind of wobbly, and we want to avoid that, right? You see this a lot. There is a time and place for this. It's not always long for it. Again, it's not very stable, especially if you're going to enter into closer plays. But we do want the weight in the balls of our feet. So again, not directly on, but I'm also not going to just be driving my heel down. Nice and light into the balls of my feet. I want my weight to be 50-50 when I'm in that good fighting stance. What I mean by 50-50 is my hips are centered over my feet. I'm not going to be forward weighted so that my back foot starts kind of leaving the ground. I also don't want to be back weighted so that my front foot is very light. I'm not like extending back. I want nice, even 50-50 weight. Okay? So what you can do at home to practice that and to get a sense for it, and this is really simple. You're going to just have to use my words because I'm not physically going to be able to show you. It's really subtle. But what you do is you kind of stand in your good position, you find your 50-50 weight, and then you figure out what it means to be back weighted, which I'm doing right now, which is very subtle. You figure out what it means to be front weighted. Very subtle. So again, I'm 50-50, I'm back weighted, I'm forward weighted. I can exaggerate that and be very forward, very, very back. But you can use this, again, either foot forward is fine, but you want to just sort of shift your weight over your feet to feel the difference between being forward weighted or back weighted as opposed to being nice and center weighted, okay? So that's something you can do at home really easily. And again, it's very subtle, and it's more just about feeling. You'll know it when it's right. So let's talk about those foot drags. Because we're on the balls of our feet, we want to step with the balls of our feet. So if I'm doing what we call at my club an advancing step, I know everybody kind of has different terms for their footwork, but that's where we take our lead leg and advance it, or retreat it. When we're keeping the lead leg forward, I'm coming off of the balls of my feet. Now I'm pushing from the back foot, that's where I'm powering my momentum, but I'm landing on the front foot first, and I'm landing gently on the ball of my foot. Do that again. So this is important because we want to avoid landing on the heel. I see this a lot where people will take their advancing step, come to the heel, and then drop the toe. Like so. So we're on the balls of the feet. Now that's just the front foot. The back foot, that's where the drag usually happens. So we advance, and people drag the foot. We want to pick up that back foot. As I go to pick it up, from the ball of the foot, the ball of the foot, and then I can kind of set myself down. I'll do that again really slow. I'm going to push from the back foot, advance, let go. Here we go. Sorry. Okay.
Totally okay. And I'm going to answer Alan's question real quick. All of our live videos are going to be on the Cybersquatch Facebook page. And then within the next couple of weeks, we will have video versions that have been edited for length and continuity on our YouTube page. So
that's good, because I don't know if this will happen again. I hope that it doesn't, but I can't really control that it's, 40 degrees Celsius. So sorry.
No worries. I'm going to let you go, and then I'm going to go get Trivial Pursuit questions so that I have them ready for if it happens again.
Great. Okay. Because it might. I don't know.
Yep.
Okay.
We've got a quick question if you want to answer one.
Sure. Go ahead.
So Sterling Nelson would like to know what the drawbacks are of landing on the heel during the advance.
Yeah. Great question. So this comes up a lot because you see like in not classical fencing, like Olympic style fencing where people will land on the heel in like really big lunges. I can't say that don't do that, because obviously there is a time and place where you do that, and it is mostly in Olympic fencing. However, some of the drawbacks, I'll just sort of show you here. Just tilt that a little bit. If we're landing on the heel, the knee straightens, the leg straightens, and it can lock. This ends up being really difficult for us to recover from that position. Again, unless we're like super highly trained Olympic level athletes that can do crazy things with their body and have incredible like springing action. In longsword, there's really no need to make such huge leaping motions. It's just, it doesn't fit into the system. So we want to avoid those kinds of things largely for this. We want to not lock out the knee. It becomes very hard to recover from. Even if we roll to here, now we're super extended, we would then have to re-engage the knee to bend in order to then come back into a safe position. As well as if we're engaging with just that hard lunge, it leaves us not really super able to do anything else. So we're kind of hoping on a Hail Mary action to land that just single thrust. It doesn't set us up very well from here to have the thrust. If we miss, you can't really do much from here. You have to then set the foot, unlock the knee, start throwing your zwerks or go to cuts, and you're very linear. And that's part of the problem, is the strict linear motion of landing on the heel. You can't pivot on the heel, which you can't see clearly. There we go. You can't pivot the body on the heel as effectively as you can pivot on the ball of the foot. With the ball of the foot, I'm able to engage the hips. With the heel, I'm not in the same way. So it limits our ability to, it limits our options after the fact. So I hope that kind of answers the question in the way that you were asking. But I'm going to kind of move on from there, if that's okay, unless you have anything to follow up with, but I'll kind of check in as we go. Okay, so landing on the balls of the feet. That's important. And this is true of passing steps as well. Again, you guys might call it something at your own home club, something different, but when we talk about passing steps at my school, a passing step is where we're taking the rear leg and we're passing it beyond the lead, creating a new lead. So we're just passing step. It's really common. Again, I don't know what everybody else's names are for it, but it's pretty universal in terms of steps. Same thing, when we're taking that passing step, I'm pushing off from the ball of the foot, landing on the ball of the foot. Pushing from the ball of the foot, and I'm going to take a really small step so I don't go out of frame, landing on the ball of the foot. As opposed to taking that passing step and landing heel toe. Again, that just sets us up to be able to pivot and do certain things like triangle steps, which we're using to pivot off of the ball of the foot, as opposed to spinning on the heel. So if I go to take a passing step and I'm going to make a triangle step, I want to pivot on the ball of my foot, not on the heel of my foot, which then requires me to have to like launch myself and spin, which is super fun if you have like, you know, the attention span of a 10-year-old like me and you just think like, wee, but super, super unsafe, not very stable. And it does, again, limit our options. So with that as well, we want to talk about stability in the ankles. We want to make sure that even when we're stepping, we're not stepping in ways that roll the ankle, right? So if I'm stepping, I'm kind of turning the foot in and I roll the ankle, obviously, I'm sure anybody watching this right now is probably just cringing at the discomfort of how this looks. You're right, it's very uncomfortable. So we want to make sure that the heel, the ankle, the foot, and we'll get to the knee in a second, they're all going to be on the same vertical plane. And what I mean by that, my ankle sits just below my knee. There is a time and place where the knee can go past the ankle, but it should not be going past the toes. And you'll hear this a lot, and a lot of people are like, oh, why? Because you'll see people do really deep stuff like this, where the knee goes way past the end of my toes. Look at my ankle. I'm not in a strong position with my ankle. Sorry, I have neighbors. We'll talk about the wrists a little bit later, but what I do want to point out is the wrists are going to be a lot like your ankles. Everybody talks about wrists or wrist position being super, super important, and it is, and that's why I'm going to come back to it. But we're more familiar with thinking about straight wrists than we are thinking about straight ankles. But we understand the idea of a straight wrist. We want to keep that in mind with our feet. Straight ankles, right? I don't want really, really deep bends in the ankle. Again, that locks out my knee. If I go past the knee, I'm starting to get that hard bend in the ankle. Now again, time and place, we're talking about longsword. Coming past this point as well is much harder to recover from. Not impossible, but this is much easier to recover back to our 50-50 as opposed to this, where I'm starting to come so forward weighted that I don't have my back leg to support me or to pull me back. So we're gonna move up into the knees, and then after the knees, I'll take some questions about lower body, because then we're gonna get into the hips, but I just wanna cover the knees really quick. Knees seem to be a hot topic in HEMA, only because there's so many like knee injuries or people with knee injuries that get aggravated in HEMA. And I think a lot of that, some of it can't be avoided. Some of it is just you got bad knees, you have an injury, and you just need to really, really, really be careful. But I think a lot of it is because we actually, as a community, we don't teach enough like good knee health stuff. And we end up getting really bad habits kind of built into our fencing because if it works, you know, why fix it, right? It's not broken, but we'll talk about the knees. So when I was talking about the same vertical plane, my knee is above my ankle. I'm gonna step back just a little bit for you. My knee is above my ankle. Now, if it's not obvious right now, it should be now. Oh. Where my knee is a good 6-7 inches away from the plant of my ankle, right? So I want my knee straight. I want my toes also in line. And lots of people have done all sorts of like classes and talks on this about how it's super important. So I'm not going to lecture you guys on how important it is. I think we kind of know that at this point in time, as far as like the HEMA community goes. But what we don't talk about is how to fix it, right? We often see collapsing knees. Like this is really common, right? You're moving, you take a step, and you collapse the knee. There used to be an old theory that to fix the knee, you turn the foot out. And this is really, I cannot stress to you how awful this is. Yes, the knee is straight. Yes, it's over the ankle, but that doesn't address the foot. It ends up putting a lot of like pressure and weird twist right through the shin and the tibia. So instead, if you put your foot straight, your knee is over your ankle, and you're still sort of naturally curved in like this, fixing it has nothing to do with down here. Fixing it has everything to do with butt. Yes, HEMA butt. Also another very popular topic, but it's true. If you have a collapsing knee, most of the time, not all the time, again, everybody's bodies have, different injuries or whatever, but most of the time, the solution is actually weak glutes. So if you're standing there, your knee is collapsed in, think about squeezing the glutes. Like as if you're gonna do a good like back squat or deadlift or whatever you're doing. Same idea, squeeze the glute, everything gets nice and aligned. Now this is really hard to do in fencing, right? Especially if you have this weakness and you're trying to apply it as you're like fencing, it's not easy. And this is not something you're gonna fix just literally by standing there being like, okay, I need to fix it and squeeze the butt. It's not gonna happen. This is going to actually require a lot of active rehabilitation. So I suggest getting like a resistance band, for example, which everybody in HEMA should have a resistance band because they are fabulous and very inexpensive tools that we can all use at home really, really easily. So you get a resistance band, you drop it just above the knees here, make sure it's not on the knees, creating pressure on the inside, but just above, and you can do things like squats where you're trying to resist the knees collapsing in. You're going to keep them nice and out. You can do lunges this way, right? If you're going to drop into a lunge, you want to keep the knee straight. There's all sorts of like rehabbing exercises that you can do or strengthening exercises that you can do for the glutes that'll help bring the knee back into alignment. Don't put a Band-Aid on it by turning the foot out. Don't put a Band-Aid on it by just stepping wider and then just hoping a wider stance or a more open hip is going to fix it. That's, and that's where injuries will come from, is that collapsed knee, putting pressure right in here, right through here. Take the time to fix it if that's an issue that you have. Okay. The other thing I want to talk about with the knees is having a nice gentle bend. We see a lot of the times people fencing, and they're very upright and kind of stiff, and they kind of like walk around the fencing ring and they're just like, okay, I'm ready, I'm doing my thing. And there's really, it looks sort of robotic and mechanical. It's really not going to help you if your knees are really tight and really locked, right? You have to then, in order to do any motion, if your knees are locked, you have to then unlock them and then do your action. So what I suggest instead, being in a good, strong fighting position already, gentle bend in the knees, right? We don't want to be upright and having to unlock them and then do our thing. Get used to being in a nice...
Oh, you're welcome back. Thank you. Okay.
Okay. I'm going to wing it from my bedroom because you might hear random football noises, and I've literally got like 4 square feet, but we're gonna do it. We're just gonna get her done.
Perfect.
Get her done.
Sorry. Okay. But that's fine because we're kind of past the huge movement part, I think. Basically, with the knees, we just want to keep a nice gentle bend, not lock them, and if they're locked, it's much more difficult for us to then re-engage because we would have to do it anyway, so you might as well be in a position from which you can move effectively and efficiently. So that kind of goes into hips a little bit, which is where I was going next. Before I jump into that, were there any questions since I left? I guess I gave everybody a good amount of time to ask questions, I guess. Sorry.
So there's one from Chris Cather. He just wants to know what kind of footwear you recommend.
What kind of footwear?
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. So I personally use Asics. That's the brand, Asics. It's like basics, but without the B. Asics wrestling shoes. And I've used wrestling shoes for years and years and years and years. I've only ever really competed in wrestling shoes, save for my first 2 tournaments. They're great. They're flat. They're super flexible. You can literally take them and just twist them like a towel. And they actually come up pretty high on the ankle, and they've got really good ankle support. And they're awesome because they're great for I would say they're very transitory. I don't think that's the right word, but you can wear them pretty much anywhere. Because I remember being at a tournament and not having the right footwear, and I was slipping all over. It was on a dance floor, and I was slipping everywhere. I had no traction. So if you go and you're in a hotel ballroom on a carpet, or if you're on puzzle mats, or you're on a gymnasium floor, wrestling shoes are just awesome. So like I said, Asics. I also know people who use karate shoes as well, but I don't know how grippy they are. So now what's the problem? Oh my gosh. Okay, hips. Hips are important. A lot of times we talk about cutting with the hips, and that's very true, but a lot of people don't actually know what that means, and they think that it's you go to throw your cut, and then just do a little super wiggle, and it's not that. So one of the things that I usually get people to do is isolate their hips, which sounds super easy, right? It's yeah, I can isolate my hips. No. What I want people to try doing, and you can do this at home right now, or you can just take a mental note of it and try it later whenever you want. But kind of stand in a nice, comfortable position. Feet should be about hip or shoulder width apart. And all you're going to do is isolate the hips. You're going to roll the hips. but you see how my shoulders are sort of like rolling with them, or like if you move your hips, your shoulders usually kind of go with. What we want to do is sort of isolate the two from each other so that I can move my shoulders independently of my hips as opposed to them swinging a little bit together, right? Nice and steady on the top, I can isolate my shoulders. It's much harder to do on the bottom. So if you're on the bottom here and you're isolating just the hips, you want to keep the shoulders straight as the hip turns. Now, in order to do that, you need to have very good core control. And that's usually more often the issue. As opposed to like just cut with turning the hips. It is actually coming from the core, and that's what we want. So that's not to say that we want to completely isolate the two of them when we're sword fighting. That's not what we want. I have a cat that I'm going to step on too, apparently. We want them to move together, right? We want that. But a lot of the times we're not able to do that. I see a lot of people kind of over committing where they're just like, I'm going to just move these two, the point of my shoulder and the point of my hip together and do this, right? They're stepping and they do this. And that's too much. Or they can't do it at all and they step and then they just roll the shoulders and it's just the shoulders moving. In order to get both functioning together, you need to be able to have control over both of them separately. Now, before we get to the shoulders, we're just going to keep at the hips and the core for now. So good core control, a lot of people think like, oh, just tighten it down. That's not wrong. And you should do that. You should like think about contracting all of it in, but I usually like to think of it a little bit lower. So you've kind of got those high abdominals, and then we've got those low abdominals. And usually when we're fencing, you see people that have weaker low abdominals, even though they've got very strong high abdominals. What I mean by that is you'll see pelvic tilts. So you can have a really hard anterior pelvic tilt like so, which is extremely uncomfortable for me to do. But you see a lot of people and they'll fence like this, and that's just how they are. And that's a weakness through here. And we want to avoid that. Obviously that's shortening and pinching out the lower back, and we'll get into that in a minute. But we really do want to avoid having the hips anteriorly tilted hard, and it's more common to see this than it is to have like a hard tilt the other way. You don't see this very often, and if you do, they're usually not saying they're not athletic, but you don't see it as often in HEMA. I see fewer tilts this way, but I see a lot of tilts this way. So this, we want the hips to be tilted back in. We want them to be neutral, as opposed to being hard one way or super hard the other. So if we have a little bit of an anterior pelvic tilt, we don't want to just go polar opposite and just like thrust it forward and then just like kind of slouch into it. We want to avoid that. We want nice, neutral hips. If you or somebody you know in your club who is willing to take your advice, don't just tell people to fix this shit. Hopefully you're in an instructor position or a coaching position, but if you or somebody else is looking to fix that, what you want to focus on is these low abdominals, right? You think about tightening this, and it naturally will bring the hips in. If I relax this, I can kind of shift my hips back. If I tighten it, it pulls the hips back into a neutral position, and that's what we want. So what you can do is you can do bridges, you can do planks, all sorts of stuff, anything that strengthens this, okay? Again, very, very easy to start neutral, and then as we go to make a step, kind of shift the hips out. We want to avoid that. We really want to train a nice neutral hip as we step so that it's not tilting out. Now, some people, when I bring this up, usually think like, well, what about sword and buckler where you have like a very hips back position? That's not the same, right? I'm not talking about just having the hips tilted back and like a hinge at the hips. I'm talking about having the hips tilted back as opposed to hinging at the hips and pushing them back in a straight line. So there is a difference. Why do I have that written?
There you go.
Okay.
Oh
I had
my God.
butt written for some reason, but that's important too, obviously, especially when we're dealing with the hips. Again, we're going to come back to that. So we talked earlier about the knee collapsing in, right? Having the knee sort of folding in and trying to keep it on the same plane. I want to try and have my hips also very level. Now, of course, if you are built with wider hips, your hip is not going to be on the same plane straight down as your knee. That's just not how that works. And that's okay, but what we want to avoid is kicking the hips out. Again, I'm hyper exaggerating for you to be able to see it, but you'll see a lot of the times people will fight and they'll kind of like shift onto one hip, right? And then they'll push the hip out. We want to keep the hips level on both planes. So we want them level this way so that I'm not like bringing one higher than the other. I think the Cardinals scored. I don't know. Sorry. Again, if you hear my husband, it's football. So we want to make sure that the hips are level here as opposed to being here. Also want to make sure that they're level, and there's a bit of a exception to this rule, but we want to make sure that they're level here as well. So if we're totally neutral and we're facing our opponent, we want our hips squared. So that means that they're on the same plane here. I'm not shifting this way or super shifted this way. So one hip is more forward than the other. We want nice level hips. Now this changes, of course, as we start to cut, and this is where the cut with the hips comes in. They start pretty even, nice and neutral. There can be a slight cant back where one hip is slightly tilted back, but we don't want bladed, right? We don't want overextending the hips, right? Way open. We slightly tilted back. They must be doing very well in that sports ball over there. When we take a step for a cut, for example, the hip will naturally shift and turn. And this is where it can start being off of that exact square plane. And that's totally fine. But what we're trying to do for this biomechanics sense is to not have our hips twisting in such a way that then we lose the power in our core. We lose the power through our glutes. They're still very excited. We want to make sure that a lot of our stability comes through the core and the hips. So we step, and they're even. They're not super bladed. I haven't stepped and kilted it out one way. I don't know if that's a word, but kilted, tilted, kicked it out, whatever it is. Now, let's go back a little bit to this arching of the low back and talking about the core. A lot of the times when we're throwing cuts, or let's say we're trying to get out a thrust or a slice, anything with like an extended arm position, a lot of the times you'll see this sort of like arch or a lean away. Again, I'm hyper exaggerating this so you can visualize it. And sometimes it's just subtle. But there's an idea that, oh, if you're cutting, you're like getting away from the strike. You're throwing your body away from it. You're going for that thrust, right? You've got your thrust, and people are like, ah! And they're like throwing themselves away from it. Structurally, that just doesn't make any sense, right? Your body is what's powering the sword, right? The sword is not this like magical thing that sort of has a mind of its own and you're just kind of like going along for the ride. Your body is putting kinetic energy into the sword. So if you're pushing the sword out, you're pushing the sword out, but then at the same time you're pulling your body away, you're taking a huge amount of power and force out of that. And that's where you can actually set yourself up for some really dangerous actions. What I mean by that is, let's say you're setting up a thrust, and it's just your basic straight line thrust. You're sort of like leaning out of it. It makes contact, has that nice bend, and it starts snapping back at you. Right? There's no way for you to resist that, and you're just coming back. Now there's a risk because the sword might kick back at you, the same way as like a firearm might kick back at you if you don't plant it nice deep into the pecs. Not only that, but if let's say you miss your thrust and you're or your opponent has parried it some way and you're like here, it's very easy for them to then close measure, and you're already on the back foot and you're very easy to manipulate, right? Your structure is off, your balance is off, and they can just come forward at you. And basically there's a whole bunch of different things they can do. That can turn into wrestling, it can turn into cuts. You've got very limited options for defending yourself. And I'm hoping that this analogy will be taken for what it is, and not made into anything else. But because I know in light of recent situations, it might sort of be touchy, but I'm really hoping that this will get through with the intention that I have, and that's to compare the way that we use our swords as the way that we would responsibly use firearms. So we talk about having the sword coming out. I want to set my body into it, not letting it pull me, not pushing away from it, but setting myself into it to properly brace my actions. And the only time I've really had a similar sort of sense was when I did a lot of trap and skeet shooting with shotguns, and I had some pretty heavy gauges. You have to set it right in, right? You set it into your body, and you have to be ready for that impact. Otherwise, there are a lot of things that can go wrong. So I think about the way that I train longsword biomechanically very similarly. There's a lot of power in the sword. Not necessarily the sword itself, but when I'm meeting an opponent, whether that's in a strike, like in a bind, or I'm meeting them head on in a grapple, I want to make sure that I am ready to withstand that motion and that action coming at me. And that means that I need to be set in my core, in my hips, down through my feet, having a good stable fighting position to be able to then throw my actions in there with intent and authority. So again, with that kind of pulling away, it's very common. I see it a lot, especially more with thrusts or baiting strikes, which is sort of odd. But I think a lot of that comes from a problem in the shoulders and the low back. So again, that kind of leaning away from our strikes, especially if we're going to go thrust, you get that sort of leaning, and we want to avoid that. So as we go to make that motion, when we start pressing our arms out, it's very common to see the shoulders round or the back round. So we're going to talk a little bit about the back and the low back. So again, if I'm leaning away this way through an action, the low back is pinching and getting really tight. The hips tilt back. We've already talked about that. So I want to make sure that instead of leaning out, I'm going to set my hips into a neutral position. That still doesn't really help what's going on up here, right? So to fix this, I want to think about squeezing the lats through here, trying to bring the shoulders down. And I'm really trying to engage the larger muscles in my back to prevent my arms from collapsing in forward, okay? So as these muscles in front are tightening, these muscles in the back are lengthening. We want to avoid that. So before I get into shoulders, because there's a lot going on in shoulders, arms, wrists, and hands, and neck a little bit too that I'm going to touch on, before I start jumping into what I consider the rest of the upper body, is there any questions about anything that I've talked about from low back, core, hips, and down? Were there any questions that popped up? No?
So far, nothing so far.
Perfect. Okay, good. Very, very good. So, let's talk about the shoulders. When we have a long sword, a lot of the mechanics are different than a single hand sword. When we have a single hand sword, we don't have to worry about both hands, both arms, thus both shoulders. What I mean by that is if I have as one does, right, in their room. With a saber, I'm allowed to have my shoulder extend. I can have a more bladed position. This doesn't apply in longsword. As soon as I try and get my second hand on what would be the hilt, I can't reach because I've pulled my shoulders apart as opposed to being together if it was a long sword. I'm allowed to get extra reach with a single hand sword by blading. But because we can't do that with longsword, I want to avoid that bladed position. We see this a lot, actually, where in my case, left hand, but for other people, your non-dominant hand, when it's at the pommel or lower on the hilt, there's a tendency to blade the shoulder really hard, and then the arm kind of just goes along for the ride and does weird things, and we'll talk about this in a second. But a lot of those problems are fixed with the shoulders. We want the shoulders to be equidistant. And what I mean by that is, again, on the same plane. So not having one super forward from the other, like that or like that. We're going to squeeze the lats so that we avoid this kind of thing. Gosh, this looks so ridiculous. But it's very common. So what we want to do, think about pulling the shoulders back and then down. Then we can extend our arms. What I'm doing is squeezing right in here through my lats. They're going to come back and down. Again, kind of hard to see when I'm wearing like just a black shirt. But trying to bring the shoulders back, expanding through the chest, and then bringing the shoulders down, which is where we're going to squeeze through the lats. We should have nice level shoulders. A lot of the times you'll see this sort of being compensated. You get the shrug, you lose a lot of the neck, so you're like this. A lot of people like to cut like this, or they thrust like this. This hyperextension of the shoulder is really, really, really unhealthy for our shoulders in general, but it also removes everything below it in terms of being able to get a lot of structure and power to resist any other actions. As soon as I start throwing the shoulders out and rounding the back, I'm basically relying on just the structure of my arms to do anything. Instead of having everything locked down, brought in, having my core, my chest, my back to help support my actions. So as soon as I start doing this, I'm losing all of the muscles in here that help support here. Okay. Are there any other questions so far? I'm afraid I'm sort of like throwing too much out there too quickly without checking in, so.
Yeah, we just got a question from, sorry, do you want to take it? Okay. From Monica Benavides.
Okay.
Some of our students have the tendency to let their upper body and shoulders become the front or center, so their body faces diagonally while their lower body faces the front. Is that more of an upper body shoulders issue or a lower body that's not set up properly?
So, okay, I'm hoping I understood that correctly. So you have somebody, can you repeat that again?
So their body faces diagonally while their lower body faces front. So
This way?
I think like that probably. But let's see if she...
I'm hoping she's watching because I want to make sure I get it right. Because depending on what it is...
Yes, she says that's correct.
Yes, okay, so doing this. Yeah, so this is really interesting because this has a lot of structural issues. This is where the shoulders and the hips then are no longer together. They're totally twisted opposite. In my case right now, again, I'm not exactly sure what her students are doing that she's referring to, but in my case, I have my right foot forward, my dominant leg here, and I've cut and I've pulled my opposite shoulder across, which is bad. You never want to cut over your lead leg. I say never with like a little star because there are exceptions to that rule, but with longsword, this is bad. We want to avoid this. Now, I'm trying to imagine how that would be the case the other way, if I cut properly. But I'm assuming that if that's what she's referring to is over the lead leg. Oh, I saw something pop up. Okay, I don't know. I can't read it. So if somebody's cutting this way, an easy fix, and again, not the entire fix, but an easy fix is making sure that they're first cutting to their open side. If they are cutting to their open side, and it's like this, and they've done this, or like, wait, if it was straight on the bottom, yeah, if they're doing this, It could be hip flexibility. Not as often, though. Not that it can't be, but it might sometimes be. People can have really, really, really tight hips. But a lot of the time, it'll just be not having enough control over the sword, and they're letting the sword pull them. So then they're not actually cutting with the core and the hips. They're sort of just throwing the arms and letting it carry them and not having the core power to come with it, I think. But unless I saw it, I would be hard-pressed to say, yes, this is the problem, unless I can see exactly what it is. But I'm not sure if Monica's watching, is there a way for me to see her screen? Is that possible? Because I'm really curious.
I think we can get her, make her a panelist and get her to share her video if she wants to.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, throw it out there, see if she will. I'll talk a little bit more while that gets figured out, or we can do it at the end, it's whatever. With the shoulders, again, I talked earlier about the shoulders and the hips moving together, okay? We want to avoid where they've moved together and then become disjointed and one goes way past the other. So I like to think that my shoulder and my hip are sort of on a string and somebody's pulling the strings equally and they move together. There are exceptions to this rule, of course, but I want to avoid where the hips and the shoulders become no longer working together, where one goes one way and the other goes another, or maybe they've come in the same direction, but one's kept moving too far. You get that a lot with the upper body kind of going too far over. Again, I'm hyper-exaggerating this, but a lot of the times the shoulder will roll way past the line of the hips. And again, this is more of a shoulder part or a shoulder problem because we're not locking in the shoulders through the back and the chest, and the weight of the sword at the end of the hands then pulls. And if we're not actually in control of the sword, it then pulls us along for the ride, which is really, really, really what we want to avoid. Did we check in with Monica? How is that going?
Yep, she's there with her video if you want to.
Yay! I'm excited. This is like a case study. Let's go.
So I'm gonna spotlight her video, and that
Great.
should put her front and center for you.
Yay!
Can you guys hear me? See me? Sorry about my own. Okay, so
Oh dear.
exactly when they're starting to fight, just when they set up. So I say, okay, everyone, we'll have your left foot forward at first. So right now my body, or my lower legs and my upper body are facing straight. They'll have the tendency to then just twist. So their lower body still faces forward and their upper body starts leaning. Or so when they're fighting and then they cut, they'll still cut, they'll be here, and then they'll end up here. So it's like the lower body's still going straight and the upper body still comes here. So I tell them, just push this back, like roll your shoulders, push it back. And then when they'll even start up, they'll be like, I'm ready to fight right here.
Yes. Okay,
so and I'm wondering, like, is it because you're going too much straight out to the side, or is it just that's something that I've been struggling to set them up properly.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
no, that's
kind of
great.
what I mean.
No, that's perfect.
Yeah.
So
Thanks.
that tells me a lot about the whole sort of body coming together, because there's a lot of different things going on there. Again, we talked about having the 2 points being able to isolate them. So it sounds like they're isolating the bottom and not really getting any hip rotation and then just swinging with the arms, right? So when we're cutting, and hopefully you guys had a chance to see Philip Martin's cutting class, because I'm sure he addressed this. Actually, I can almost guarantee he did. But when we're cutting, we want to make sure that we're cutting with the body as opposed to having the hips stay center and then just cutting with the arms or the shoulders, right? You can see that like my body isn't moving. It's just like my arms, as opposed to cutting with the hips. So what you can do and get your students to practice to fix that, first, start with just the shoulders. Have them cut to long point. So have them, I'm assuming you guys do German. I just realized not everybody does German. You can start them in a high position, whatever it is, out here, up here, cutting to the center line and have them on the center line. Okay, that's the most important thing. A lot of people sort of forget that and think to just cut all the way through and then get pulled with it, and then you have that hyperextension of the shoulder. Hi, husband. Okay, he just poked his head in. Bye. Okay. So, cutting first to the center line. From here, have them really squeeze the shoulders back, make sure that they're not overextending, because again, this is really, really common. They cut to the center line, shoulders back and down, as opposed to like hunched up. Back and down. From here, have them finish the cut with the body. And make sure that when they're finishing their position, it's finishing in like a good strong Albert, as opposed to like cutting all the way down. There's a tendency to start tilting the weight forward. Again, that's because there's the weight of the sword at the end of our hands. If we're not structurally sound through our back, our core, our shoulders, it's very easy for the weight of the sword to start pulling us over. Especially if we're like planted super hard on the ground with our feet and we're like cutting, it's very easy to get pulled way over, no matter which foot you have forward. Even if you're cutting to the open side, very easy to just like get the weight to throw you and you're sort of just not in control. So have them really practice, again, keeping the shoulders nice and tight, thinking about pressing out through the chest, and have them really focus on cutting these two together. To the center, to finish. To the center, to finish.
Okay.
And trying to get these two to move together. That's sort of the big one that I can see. But again, hard to say unless I'm actually seeing the actual person make the mistakes. But that was really good, because that's a great way to sort of link the two that I was talking about before. Have there been any other questions in regards to that at all, or can I carry on? No.
Yeah, we have one question in chat. Do you strictly, this is from Connor Heaton, do you strictly recommend against cutting toward the lead leg from a not injuring yourself perspective?
Yes. Yes, I do. When we're talking about longsword specifically, we do not want to cut over or towards the lead leg. Again, there's an exception to this rule, and I'll talk about that in a sec, to the point of passing the center line. So when we're on the center line, to here, it doesn't matter, right? Right now I have just so you can see, I have my right foot forward. If I cut from my left, it's okay for me to cut to the center line. That's okay, even though I'm cutting in the direction of my lead leg. Once I've crossed the center line, that's where my hips and my shoulders can no longer work together. This just doesn't function. I'm losing my core structure here. Having it turn against itself, I'm not able to actually keep it locked in and get the full effectiveness of that. Now, of course, we have like exceptions. Like if you're doing single hand sword, it doesn't matter. Not to the same degree. I can cut over my lead leg, but it doesn't matter because I don't have to worry about the equidistance of my arms. And I'll get into that once I kind of get past shoulders a little bit. But for longsword, no, because we're relying on two hands on the weapon, the shoulders need to be quite equal and balanced. As soon as they become unbalanced, that's where you start seeing, see how my hands are sort of pushing and pulling? I left my longsword outside because I didn't think I'd be able to not destroy anything in here, but if my hands are sort of not equal, you can see how much movement the sword has, right? I'm trying to find that equal room. So if my shoulders are shifting, my sword is not able to be like straight. And this is kind of like, a lot of people will probably argue with me because a lot of people have a really outdated idea of you want to push and pull the sword. No, you don't. You want to push and pull the sword if the only thing you're cutting with is literally your hands, and you're not. You want to cut with the entire body. As soon as we create a different distance between the shoulders, we're no longer able to cut with the whole body. Again, that doesn't apply to a single hand sword because we're allowed to blade. We don't have to worry about the other hand being able to reach the pommel. So it doesn't matter. Structurally speaking, once we cross the center line, here, my hips, my shoulders, they're opposite, right? I'm not able to then use my hips. I'm not then able to use the whole balance of my lower body. It really does, I'm gonna step back just a little bit so you guys can kind of see. If I cut over my lead leg, everything pulls. My shoulder pulls hard. I lose a lot of the hip structure. The power from my glutes on my left leg is totally lost. Again, I'm exaggerating it, but even if I'm just doing it earnestly, let's say, that just popped. Ow. Here to here, I'm still losing a lot of core balance right in here. Again, when it's to the center line, things like a Zornhau, things like a Sheitelhau, again, I'm using German. It's the only system I know. It doesn't matter because we're not crossing that center line. We're not actually coming over past the point of the hips. So I can cut to the center line and I'm fine. But as soon as I cross the center line, that's where I'm losing a lot of that power. So a lot of the times you'll see people start right leg forward, left Vomtag, they'll cut, they're bringing the hip square to the center and stepping as they finish. Looks kind of weird and disjointed, but if you do it like at full speed, it makes sense. But yeah, so I am personally and strongly opposed to a full cut over the lead leg with a longsword. That was a really long-winded way of saying how I felt. So sorry. Hopefully that kind of addressed why, though. I mean, you know. Okay. So I want to cover a couple things.
Before you move on, Brittany, I do have a quick question that came up earlier, and we've moved past it a little bit, but I wanted to get back and make sure that we got it answered. Connor Heaton says, do you strictly recommend against cutting towards the lee leg, e.g. cut from upper right with the left leg forward from a not injuring yourself perspective?
Yeah. Yes. Did I not just...
No, that was what she just answered.
Oh, my bad. I'm sorry.
Okay. I was like, oh no, did my video cut out? And it was like, all of that was lost. Okay. No, we're good. Other than that, that was the only one, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good.
Very sorry.
Very good. It's all good. It's all good. I was so worried there for a second. I was like, oh dear. Okay, so we've talked about the shoulders. We want to make sure, for longsword, again, specifically, that the shoulders are equidistant. Equidistant, again, being I'm not having one super forward over the other. There is going to be like a few little inches just because of the nature of one hand being on top of the other. But we want to make sure that it's not like I'm cutting and then I'm like super bladed or ending in like really like turned over positions. And this becomes really interesting when we start talking about how the arms are structured in our cuts. And this applies to thrusts as well, but it's just a little bit easier to explain with cuts. They are really enjoying their football over there, sorry. So the equidistance of the shoulders plays a really important part in the arms, okay? So we have a tendency with modern faders to have longer and longer and longer hilts. Now, I can see why. I'm not saying it's wrong. Obviously, they've kind of grown to accommodate like the width of our equipment. So like spez heavies are super, super wide, especially for my tiny little hands. Like my spez heavies take up my entire hilt of the sword. when I wear them, but my hands, I've got like 6 inches of like extra hilt for my hands to fit on. So obviously they've kind of grown with the community, but the longer the hilt is, the more we desire to have the hands spaced further apart. And this can be a little bit problematic in terms of structure, okay? Again, we have that sort of outdated idea of like really wide grip when we want to push-pull. You can kind of see how that sort of shifts the shoulders again. We really don't want that, but it's hard to fix that when we've got really long hilted long swords, where if you narrow the grip, the pommel hangs off, there's a huge amount of space, and then it just feels really awkward and clunky. So, you know, train this as you need to, but keep in mind that from a structural and kind of geometric perspective, the more narrow grip is more ideal for longsword. And what I mean, but you know, I think I should be able to not hit anything. Hopefully, if I grab a sword, it should be okay. I mean, as long as I'm not swinging for the fences, I'm gonna grab a sword. It'll be easier. Of course, I lost that. Okay. So, hitting my ceiling. Siggies, this is a Siggy, by the way, are pretty long hilted, and specifically they've been designed that way to fit spez heavies. So this is not a critique of the Siggies, but this is a great example as to why. You can see how small my hands are, and this is a Siggy shorty, so I have very tiny hands. But when we have a really wide grip on the sword, and here I just put my hand right here at the pommel, not directly on it, but right as it sort of starts to flare. This is sort of like the normal way people usually will hold a longsword, right? They kind of have really wide grip, hand right at the cross, hand down at the pommel, here. Nothing structurally wrong here. There is a little bit of blading in my shoulders. When I have my spez heavies on, there's not much I can do about that. However, I just want to point out, let's say we're cutting to a tip down position. For us KDF practitioners, that would be Albert. If we've got a very wide grip, we cut down to Albert. You can see my left arm here is quite bent. My shoulder might even be coming up to compensate. And a lot of people are like, so? Right, so if I narrow the grip, I'm able to have nice structure through the arms. Now, that's not to say this is necessarily wrong. We see a position very similar to this in Fiore. But this position, now don't quote me, is not necessarily meant to cut with, like in terms of like a good strong hue. My understanding of this position is more of a deflection, in which case you don't necessarily need a lot of structure to do. But if we're cutting, again, with intention, a good structured hue, we want to be able to have as much efficient structure as possible through our body to power our cuts efficiently. Now, I'm not saying go and use an arrow grip for everything, but just keep it in mind. If we are cutting, I want to keep the shoulders equidistant, because as soon as I get this happening, you get that chicken wing. You see this a lot, especially that kind of push-pull mechanic. We'll talk about the wrists in a minute here too. But it's much more common to get the elbows kind of up in weird positions. A lot of times you'll see people sort of do these sort of positions with the elbows, or you have, what's another favorite? Oh, I just hit my ceiling. I knew I was going to do it. Okay, well, I own the house, so it's not a big deal. With the elbows, we want to try and avoid flaring, okay? Now we can fix flaring a few ways. One, we can fix flaring where they're coming out this way by tucking them in. And this comes from, again, the shoulders. If I'm flaring and I've got a hunch and I just bring them down, it doesn't really fix anything. If I'm flaring, bring the shoulders back and then squeeze down. So we want the shoulders nice and tight and we want the elbows close in. Now, if we're doing something where we're cutting, and you see this a lot, you see somebody cutting and they get this kind of non-dominant chicken wing. The structure of a cut relies on the length of the arms, which then again relies on the equidistance of the shoulders. There's a nice gentle bend in the elbow. I don't want to lock out my elbow and create like a hyperextension. This can create like a lot of stress in the elbow, and maybe even, depending on how hard you're like popping it out, it can cause injuries after a while. So we want to avoid hyperextending the elbows. But we do want a gentle bend, just a little like unlock. Nice long extended arms, and this is for our long cuts, things like overhouse, unterhouse, anything with the true edge, with a long true edge with a standard grip. This doesn't really count for Zwerkhaus. Again, I know I'm being very Kadiak specific, but if we're cutting true edge, basic cuts, nothing fancy, we want that nice, long, extended arms, okay? If we have really hard bends in the, or really hard lock in the elbows, you can see how it sort of shrugs my shoulders up. We want to avoid that. Again, shoulders down and relaxed, gentle bend in the elbows, and we'll talk about the wrists in a little bit. But for now, we want those elbows. So we want to fix weird flaring bits. Hard bends in the elbow are not necessary. We don't want to cut like this. We want to extend for maximum reach, but maximum structure as well. So if we're cutting long out here, the way it's engaging our pecs and our back has everything locked in to power that cut. If we're cutting from here and then just pulling it down, we lose a lot of power just by that little bend in the elbow. We also lose a lot of reach. So a lot of times when people are doing cutting, this has turned into a cutting thing. That's fine. A lot of times when people are cutting, they'll start really good and then they'll bring it in and they'll kind of like draw it. There's a lot of reasons why this is not super effective. One, it's shortening our measure. I had a hard time saying that. Our reach or our measure, right? If I'm able to come all the way out here trying to hit my opponent, I do, let's say maybe, but then I'm drawing it back, I haven't really completed my cut. I've shortened the amount of reach that I have. The other kind of side of that too is we're talking about the energy of the sword. We're throwing it out and through. As soon as we pull back, we are removing a lot of the forward momentum from our cut, and a lot of the energy is then pulled away from the power that we've put into it. And that, again, just comes from keeping the arms nice and extended. I think I saw something pop up. I'm not sure. I just saw it flash really quick, so I don't know if that was a question or I don't know what it was, but if my mod could check, that'd be super. Just so I'm not missing anything.
Just making sure that everyone knows how to ask what. Oh, we just had one pop up.
Yay!
So Connor would like to know, do you always keep your chest fully square with your opponent when you're cutting, like during the pre-fencing? Some images for German longswords seem to depict more of a side-face posture, anatomically dubious, though.
Right.
Dubious they may be. He also sees it fairly frequently with fencers more focused on the thrust.
Wait, there was more to that question?
Yes, sorry, he just said that he also sees it fairly frequently with fencers more focused on the thrust.
Okay, so let's start with the first part of that. So am I advocating for being totally square in the pre-fight? No, not specifically. There are lots of things that you can do outside of the pre-fight that don't matter. you could literally, and I'm again not saying you should, but you could literally just like walk up with your sword and like before anything's happened, and it doesn't matter. If nobody's in measure, nobody's threatening, and you're not offending, it doesn't matter. You can literally just walk around like this with your sword. You see people do it all the time in tournaments where they're so far from one another that they get really lazy and they're sort of just like figuring it out and they're just like chill, right? So no, I'm not saying that, you know, in the pre-fight that you need to be perfectly square and like facing your opponent. What I am advocating for, though, is if you're going to talk about good structure in long cuts, well, and other cuts, but in this case, for now, long cuts, I want to make sure that I am going to be square in order to cut. Now, it ends up not being square as I'm cutting through, but that also relies on my lateral footwork. I was going to say linear, lateral footwork. So just, you know, keep in mind these are not be-all, end-all rules. You have to do them, and there's no exceptions. There are historical examples of stuff that I think is like structurally really bizarre, and would like make modern sports science cringe. That doesn't mean that it, you know, they didn't do it. It might not have been like the safest thing in the world. But I'm also not saying that the sources are wrong either. This is just, again, if you want to fence in a way that is structurally sound and provides a lot of good balance and stability so that when you're cutting, when you're thrusting, when you're slicing, or going into a grapple, you're in a sound position, you can deliver martial blows with good authority and intent, then yes. Understanding when and how to square the body in the fight is a skill in and of itself. So I usually will, when I'm starting people off, I teach my students first to like know what it is to square the body and know what that means. Being able to say exactly when to do it, or why, that comes after. I just need them to know that this is better than this. And that's the difference. When I'm fencing, it depends. If I'm doing longsword, obviously, yes. I'm going to try and stay square on my opponent, just similarly to a boxer. And then as I'm throwing my cuts, I will step offline, and I'm ending up square on my opponent again anyway. But yes, there are exceptions that you can find in sources that might contradict that. So it just depends on what part you want to take literally or not. From an art historical perspective, which is more my expertise, I guess, is actually art history. There are a lot of cases where, especially some of the earlier fencing depictions, biomechanically, it makes absolutely no sense. You have like weird like elbows. Anybody looked at 133 and seen like the body positions in that and been like, that's not even possible for humans? So I don't always take what the images show as like perfect depictions. Once you start getting into the later medieval and Renaissance depictions, some of the things that like Albert Dürer did, even like the reason why I like Mayer so much is for the depictions being anatomically more accurate, then I find that a little bit more useful in terms of like it needs to look like the pictures. But if your sources don't have the greatest pictures, I wouldn't really like obsess over like exactly where the foot is or exactly how the arm is positioned, because the anatomical accuracy is just not always there, if that makes sense, I think. And then there's a second part of that about thrust, right?
I think you've covered it. He just wanted to know, like he sees the shoulders offline being common with fencers who are focused on the thrust.
Yeah, I think when I see that with longsword, I think a lot of the times I've noticed a correlation between them having done Olympic style fencing, like épée and stuff, where they are using a single hand weapon and they become a lot more bladed in their positions, and then they translate it to longsword, and instead, you know, they found a way to make it work, and then they have to like kilt the. I keep saying kilt. That's not the word I want. You see a lot of times they'll pull the shoulder up to avoid pulling the pommel away. So when you have a longsword and your thrusts are coming here, you got a really bladed position. How many times do you see this, right? Where they're very bladed, but to compensate for the second hand, which I cannot reach right now, I need to then roll my shoulder over and then hunch the shoulders up towards my neck, and you start seeing this. That's not good. That's bad. That is not structurally sound fencing. Again, just because it works doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most efficient or even like the most kinesiologically safe or healthy for our muscles and our bodies. So if we're thrusting, this is getting into a whole other topic, but the way that I thrust, I end up changing my grip so that I can have a more equidistant shoulder, and then I use my feet to carry my thrust, as opposed to trying to get that extra reach with my arms. So I'm relying on my lower body and my footwork to carry my thrust, as opposed to trying to gain that extra distance with the bladed position and then shoving my shoulder out of position to make it work and keep my point online. So that's my opinion. I'm not dogging on anybody for doing it, but just something to keep in mind, maybe. So now we've kind of covered elbows, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, we covered elbows, we're good. The last thing I kind of want to cover is the hands and the wrists. So I said earlier on that HEMA loves to talk about wrist positions. This has like been the hot topic since like 2010. Everybody obsessed over the wrists. And for good reason. For good reason. A lot of the times when people first start learning, they don't really care about what the wrists are doing. And that's very evident for anybody who's been a coach or an instructor for any length of time knows most people when they start out have no sense of like good wrist position. So it's very important, and it should always be a hot topic. But I'm trying to not like beat a dead horse with it because it has been such an important and overdone topic. But of course, we know wrists should be straight. I'm going to tell you guys a little trick that I stole from Sean Franklin, who I think stole it from RJ McKeon. And I don't know if RJ took it from anybody else, but as far as I know, it originates with RJ, but I totally stole it from Sean Franklin. Talking about good wrist positions is looking for the little wrinkles in the wrists. So when my wrist is bent this way, obviously you can see this little arc, but you can see little wrinkles right in here. So then if I'm this way, you can see the wrinkles right in here. Again, this way, wrinkles here. This way, wrinkles here. Now that's obvious, right? That's super, super obvious. Nobody's going to refute that. Yeah, your skin will wrinkle when it bends one way or the other. How does that relate to sword stuff? Well, if you are ever fighting and you have a moment or you're drilling, pick a position and finish, whatever it is. Find the position you're in. Okay, great. Let's pick like a really like bad wrist position. Okay, so I'm here and I'm like, this feels good. You can see, like, one way that you can always check your own position if you're not sure about, like, the wrists being straight, you can look at how the skin is wrinkling. A good straight wrist will not have that, okay? Obviously, there are natural, like, little parts of the skin that'll bend, but I'm really trying to avoid where it starts to crinkle, right? So, again, I'm trying to get that pictured. It's not really working, but, again, it's just a little tool that you can use. And this is so true of when you're cutting and you're ending up in really like hard positions. You can either look for the hard arc one way, or you can look for little wrinkles and creases in the skin on the other side. And that's true of all positions. But what I like to talk about when it comes to wrists, again, having them straight, we often forget, or at least like newer people, won't seem to realize or do forget that the sword can move in the hands. And that's what makes good hand structure. So people talk about like, oh, don't death grip the sword. And yes, don't don't death grip the sword. There's no reason, right? You don't have to have such a strong, hard grip on it that like you cannot manipulate it in the hand. You should be able to switch your grip quite soundly to do what you need to do, and then still maintain good wrist structure. But in order to do that, you need to have a relaxed enough grip to move the sword in the hands, but also not so much that you're like letting go and readjusting, or like just sort of hanging on with the fingertips as you go, right? And where the wrists start becoming important is with your non-dominant hand. So people will often learn quickly that the right hand can manipulate, right? You can go from what we call a thumb grip to a standard grip or a handshake grip and back pretty easily. And you can see the wrist stays nice and straight. We start ignoring what the non-dominant hand is doing, and we start like, the right hand will get used to moving the sword, but then the left hand just sort of comes along for the ride, right? Like just sort of, and that's where you start getting, there we go, those hard bends in the wrist so it's not straight anymore. This comes up a lot when we're first teaching people how to do, again in German, an ox position. So you tell someone, okay, go to ox, and they might have the right or the dominant hand straight and fine, but then they start getting weird elbow positions. They fix the elbow and then they get weird wrist positions. This is because the left hand is not moving on the sword. They have committed to this position, and then they're trying very hard to just like move it where they need to move it. And you start seeing strange wrist positions for people when they are moving from one position to the next. I'm gonna try not to hit my ceiling or my fan. The Vomtag position is like the easiest, and then as soon as you get somebody to transition to something else, you start getting weird wrists. And that's often, again, because the sword is not moving in the hand. And that's the problem. So I want to be able to have my hands, both of them, my right and my left, always in a strong, straight wrist position, whether that's my handshake grip or my thumb grip. But you can see as the sword moves in my left hand, my wrist position stays pretty sound. Solid. English is tough. Dang, okay. Both hands are able to adjust on the sword without having to death grip and just twist and hope for the best, right? That's bad. So, for anybody that doesn't know, why are straight wrists really important? One, wrists are full of like little delicate tendons and little bones and stuff. They're not super strong. They're not really sturdy. And we're now putting several pounds of weight at the very, very end of them. And as soon as we break the structure of our wrists, oh gosh, this is uncomfortable. I am now balancing the weight of the sword with just my wrist. All of that weight is sitting right here in my wrist. And that's a lot of weight for just a tiny little wrist like mine to hold. So we want to make sure that we are then transferring that energy through the arm. Okay, the arm is significantly stronger than just the wrist on its own. Add in the second hand, you now have two arms significantly stronger than one. But then we want to make sure we get the shoulders so that we engage the chest and the back, and so on and so forth all the way down the chain. And now we have the most effective amount of body to support and control the sword. But if we lose the structure in the wrists, that's where we are relying on our wrists to do all of the work. And that can then cause injuries and strain. You hear a lot of people complain about, my wrist, or, tennis elbow or whatever. A lot of that is coming from problems stemming from here. So you death grip the sword, you have no play in the hands, you're death gripping, maybe you've got a poor wrist position and you're hitting the pedal really hard again and again and again. it'll cause repeated stress in the arms, and that's where you can start getting, again, tennis elbow, little bits of kind of stress and small damage in the wrist, and we want to avoid that. Wrists are very finicky and don't like to heal very quickly, so we want to make sure that they're staying very healthy. So when I first started HEMA, again, this is another thing I stole from Sean Franklin. Apparently I steal a lot of things from Sean Franklin, but that's fine. He was my coach for many, many years. So, I picked up a lot of stuff along the way. But one of the things that he had me do to really focus on keeping my wrists nice and straight and to get used to using my whole body and my arms for my cuts as opposed to just the wrists, he actually had me wear wrist braces. And that was so helpful and so difficult, especially when we're used to flowing through our cuts. We like the idea of cutting, breaking the wrists, and then cutting back, breaking the wrists, cutting back, and doing all sorts of rolly, wristy, I'm at a rave kind of sword fighting, dancing, rolly, wristy stuff. It looks really flashy, and it can be like super fast, but at the end of the day, that can cause repeated stress injuries, and we want to avoid that. So like I said, I had to wear wrist braces for a few weeks just to get used to, cut, and not roll the wrists and try and get the sword, the weight of the sword off of my wrists. With that said, obviously, there's good wrist structure, and then there's what's happening with the fingers. And these are the smallest parts of the body in terms of what we're going to talk about for the overall biomechanics today. Again, not hitting the ceiling. When I'm controlling the sword, I want to make sure I'm actually engaging all of my fingers. People love to get really pedantic and debate about hand positions on swords. I don't know why, but again, this is my experience. This is what I've learned over so many years of doing this and trying to not attain a plethora of injuries. People have a tendency to just sort of grab with the index finger and the thumb. That's not to say their hands aren't it, but they're most of the focus is in these two fingers, so the thumb and the index finger, and they're just squeezing and the rest is just sort of there. Try and really think about getting all four fingers engaged on the blade, but using the back two fingers, that's your ring finger and pinky finger, to really squeeze the sword. Okay? That'll help end up getting the tip moving, getting a lot of tip velocity for your cuts. Tip velocity, I don't like how that sounds. Tip speed, I guess, getting the point moving out before the hands. And if we're just going to grab here, I'm not really able to do that to the same effectiveness as having my back two fingers close in on the sword. Now again, make sure we're keeping that good strong wrist position, which then relies on us coming in for a handshake grip. If I have a hammer grip, right, as soon as I want to get the point out towards my opponent, I either need to drop the hand totally 90 degrees, or I need to compromise my wrist to get the point out. So instead of compromising the wrist, I go into my handshake, which then relies on my back two fingers to get the point out. So I'm squeezing the back two fingers. And that's sort of what I've got. So are there any other questions or anything I can address in terms of some of the basic ground up biomechanics for longsword? I'm happy.
Yes, we do have one question that just came in from Matthew Curry. If you could sum up the difference between men's and women's biomechanics to a few data points, what would they be?
Yes. Okay. So this is a loaded question, I think. I don't want to categorize it between men's and women's only because I'm sort of in a weird gray area. I'm built not super feminine. I don't have really wide hips. So I sort of fall a little bit in a weirder side. But the big difference when we're teaching, if you're talking about teaching the differences between like men and women, there are some differences. Obviously, you talk about hip structure and hip flexibility. That can differ. Obviously, sometimes on average, obviously men have different or a higher level of muscle mass, and that can sometimes, make things easier. But it's less about biomechanics, and what I think more often is physical literacy. And that's huge. That plays a huge part in somebody's ability to have good mechanics. So more often, because like young boys, go Cardinals! Stop! So young boys, I think, are often put into sports and other physical activities when they're really young, and they kind of stick with it throughout most of their lives. And they have excellent physical literacy because of that. Young girls, that's less common. I'm not saying it's not common, but it's less common. So more often you'll see a woman come in and start doing HEMA, and they have not the same level of physical literacy because they maybe haven't been as physically active in their lives. So it's more like, how do I teach a woman to do this? And it's really, they're not that different. Our wrists work the same way, our elbows work the same way, our shoulders work the same way. Everything else is like pretty much the same. What you want to focus on is not the differences between men and women. The things you want to focus on is the differences between each individual person. You want to consider things like injuries or susceptibilities to injuries, certain pre-existing conditions that can make certain things a problem, like herniated discs, for example. You want to look at things like just physical forms. So obviously with women, we talk about like, cutting around breasts. There are things we can do, there are tricks that we can do to help that, but the structure of it is still the same. The way that we want to cut through with the hips is still the same. Just because my hips might be a little bit wider compared to whatever other parts of my body than some other man, doesn't mean that I need to do it differently. Okay? I will have certain issues. I have an old labral tear in my hip that still gives me problems. That will be more of a hurdle than me just being a woman. So don't think about it as like differences between men and women. Think about it more between differences between individuals, and that'll really open up your coaching and your ability to instruct people to a much more helpful level, because you will have men come in who are not built like the average man. You will have women come in who are not built like the average woman. And if you just focus on like, women just have, wider hips, so they're different, it's really going to close your mind to the way the body structures the whole cutting mechanics, the whole thrusting mechanics, everything behind it. Physics and geometry only work in so many ways, So, don't think about it too much. You're not wrong, and it's a good consideration for how you want to coach women and men. But it's just a small little facet, it's a small little detail in the larger picture. So hopefully that kind of answers the question and maybe is helpful. I'm not sure. But that's my opinion, obviously. So that's kind of how I go about teaching my own students, for sure. So yeah. Were there any other questions that came in there, or am I good to wrap up?
We do have one more question that came in. Yes. Do you have any, Sterling Nelson says, do you have any tips or drills to help keep arms aligned and elbows from flaring while not hunching the shoulders with your hands overhead, e.g. Myers high Vomtag?
So being in this position here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, actually. So obviously the most simple answer to that is be in this position without a sword. Get used to, and use a mirror, use a video. Video is one of the most helpful tools that modern day science has provided to me as a HEMA practitioner. It's being able to record every little thing that I do, and then I go back and I look at it and go, I can see this, I can see that, I can see this, I can see that. So take the time, get a mirror or a video, film yourself in profile, film yourself head on, and start just naturally coming to that position. You want to be in your high Vomtag. If you're here and you're hunching it out like this, or you're here and you can't get your arms straight up, there's no amount of longsword drills that you can do that's going to require certain exercises and physical rehabs to end up allowing your body to do that. That's not going to be a sword thing, that's going to be a gym thing. Depending on if it causes you pain or if there are problems there, consider seeing a physiotherapist, an osteopath, or any kind of active rehab for that. If you're just sort of on your own and maybe you have like more of a sedentary life and you're not used to moving or you're new to it, a lot of things you can do. If you just want to think about pulling the shoulders back, squeezing them down, and then trying to just push, keeping the elbows tucked in here. Bring the arms straight up over the head and back to here. Doesn't have to be super straight, just to here. And then from there, straight down, keeping the shoulders tight and back as opposed to letting them fall. And that sounds really like stupidly simple, and I'm sure that's not like the really cool, like awesome answer that anybody was looking for. But learning to control the muscles in your arms and your shoulders, and the shoulders are super finicky too. Another great thing that you could use is, what are they called? They look like bowling pins, Indian clubs. So doing Indian club exercises, getting the shoulder to be mobile enough to come up over the head without like this. If you start extending the arms and it hurts, there's going to be a problem. You know, if you can't bring the arms straight up, that's going to be, you know, tight in here or tight in the traps or tight through the back. You know, consider certain exercises to help with that. But again, unless I can see it, I can't exactly tell you what's wrong. But if you don't have pain at all, if it's just like, oh, how do I just do this and get used to it? That'll just be drilling. This is another great exercise with a resistance band that I used to do. I would have, I would tie it if I could. Sometimes I had like a rafter or a beam that I could tie it to, and all I would do was just pull to here and come back and pull. And then as it was coming back, obviously the resistance band wants to snap back. So I would resist the whole way with the shoulders and then come back down as well. So that's something you can do. If you don't have something to tie your resistance band to, you can have somebody help you where they will push your hands this way and you will push down on them here, and then they will basically give you resistance this way as you come back up. It might get a little bit tight in here though. So hopefully, I don't know, maybe that answered the question. But again, without me seeing some of this stuff, it's kind of hard to answer it. So that's what I've got for that. So, anything else? No?
Yeah, sorry, there's a question about Sheitelhau that I'm just trying to find here.
Oh, good.
Where is it, Carrie?
Oh, it was in the chat just a moment back.
It's from Connor.
Oh, so Connor just wants to know how you personally do a Sheitelhau. He says that it seems awful on the wrists to him.
Oh, I personally do a Sheitelhau, and it seems awful on the wrists. Okay, yeah, no, for sure. Let me not hit my ceiling again. Okay, I'm probably gonna hit the ceiling if I do that. So you can start in a high position, obviously. As I'm coming down, I'm just coming to long point to Albert. There really shouldn't be a lot of wrist breaking. I don't know. Oh, I'm really hesitant to do it in here with my sword, but I'm gonna try. Nope, that's not gonna work. Wonder what I can use. There's gotta be a sword-like object. Like this. Oh, little rattan stick. Okay, here we go. So from here, I'm in that nice handshake grip. I'm going to squeeze the back 2 fingers. It gets the tip moving forward. I'm just cutting to long point. That's it. Right to there. And then I can finish an elbow, and it doesn't end up torquing the wrist. A lot of people think that you want to go like this and flick over the top. I understand why people think that. I understand where we're getting that from the sources, but I think we're getting a little bit too hyper-focused on that one detail. So the Sheitelhau, really, it just needs to come straight down. And when it talks about plunging the point, that's where it can get a little bit more complicated. That's where you can start doing things like inverting the pommel. Again, I can have a very straight wrist in that position, and that's not a problem. But that's sort of how I do it. I'm just focusing on cutting to long point. If somebody stops me from before that, then I'm able to invert the pommel, or I can wind. But I don't know, again, how that is maybe working for you. That's what I do. And that was the question, I think. It was, well, what do you do? So that's what I do. Yeah. And I only know because I've cut to Tommy mats with the Sheitel, and I had to figure it out because I was like, okay, I had the same idea to like flick the wrists down, and obviously as soon as there was impact on the mat, it was like not doing anything. I totally lost all of my power, and it sort of just like bounced back at me, which was like not fun. But I really had to just keep that good structure and think about cutting from my high Vomtag down to Alber with good wrist mechanics and good like arm structure too. And then all the plays that come off of the Sheitelhau, they will require like little tweaks and stuff. But as long as what you're doing, again, is that good structure, you never want to do something that's painful. You know, if you're doing something, no matter what it is, especially though in chemo with longsword, more often because it's so much heavier than the other swords. If it hurts, don't do it. If it hurts, it's probably your body saying that you're maybe doing something not quite right. And that's okay. That's totally okay to admit to yourself and be like, maybe I'm not doing it right. I mean, even after so many years, I mean, my first HEMA class was 2011. I can't tell you the amount of things that I've done wrong or incorrectly and had to go back to the drawing board and be like, yeah, maybe that wasn't correct.